Novocherkassk, a southern Russian town, the jail. A man is awaiting a date with his executioner. Like anyone sentenced to death, he's nervous. Any knock at the door could be the last. I'm nothing but an actor who's performed a role to earn an Oscar and to get into the Guinness Book of Records, that's all. Let the person who's written the scenario for all this explain it to the people. I'm asked, describe how it all happened. But what can I explain when they didn't show me the case file? They hid it. They're hiding it all. They've put great things in there, painting me as a beast, that's all. And now people look at me. They must put up with me here. The city of Rostov-on-Don. Here, on April the 14th, 1992, began one of the most dramatic trials in Russian legal history. Sadist, accursed killer, the voices in the court are crying. Son of a bitch, scum. What have you done? Killer, vile creature. Hand him over to us, we'll make a court fit for him. Chikatilo, a former schoolteacher and devout communist, was accused of killing and mutilating 53 women and children over a period of 12 years. Leonid Akubjanov, the local judge who presided, had the task of analyzing each of the murders. For 6 long months, Chikatilo described in detail how he picked up his victims at railway stations, bus stops, and on street corners, and lured them to their death in the woods. The case against him took prosecutors more than a year to build up. It filled more than 200 volumes. The evidence was often too much to bear for those who had lost their loved ones. Sometimes even his guards couldn't stand it. Chikatilo's trail of death began here in Shakhty. In 1978, aged 42, he began teaching at a technical school. He was married with 2 children and lived in a hostel attached to the school. To the people of this small mining town, north of Rostov, he was an upstanding member of society, one of the small elite who belonged to the Communist Party. Unknown to his wife, he bought himself a rundown shack in a little lane on the outskirts of town. Mezhevoy Lane, number 26. Here, on October the 22nd, 1978, Chikatilo carried out his first murder. 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova. Chikatilo had met the girl at a nearby tram stop and persuaded her to come back with him to his house. After she walked through the front door, he turned off the light, forced her to the ground, and strangled her. After killing the girl in the house and mutilating her body, he brought her here. He threw her body, together with her bag and clothing, into the rushes. 2 days later, the body of Lena Zakotnova was found 150 meters from here, in that direction, near the bridge. Not far from here lived Kravchenko. He was subsequently arrested in connection with the murder, and he was sentenced to death. Alexander Kravchenko, then aged 25, was an obvious choice for police. He'd already been convicted of one murder, but narrowly escaped execution. He spent 6 years in jail instead. This time around, he was not so fortunate. The fact that he lived just a few doors away was an unhappy coincidence. He was made to confess to the killing. Leonid Akubjanov, the judge who convicted Chikatilo, calls it a tragedy. The police and the prosecutors had good reason to suspect Chikatilo. That's the most terrible thing. Chikatilo was seen with a girl. They made an identikit picture which looked like him. If Kravchenko, who was shot, had not been convicted, then they might have convicted Chikatilo instead. And there wouldn't have been all those terrible murders which followed, those 52 murders. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, into a family of peasants in the village of Yablochnoye in the Ukraine, in the midst of the worst famine the country had ever known. Millions of peasants died as the Soviet dictator Stalin forced them out of their family land holdings and into collective farms. There was worse to come. In 1941, Hitler launched his blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union. Ukraine was one of the first areas to be occupied by the invaders. Chikatilo's father was sent to war and was soon taken prisoner. Conditions on the home front were appalling, leaving an indelible mark on those who lived through them. We were sitting in the cellar and our hut was on fire. There were dead and wounded people, and they were loading the dismembered bodies in front of me, all those limbs. Then there was the famine. And the whole time my mother used to say to me, "Don't go anywhere outside the courtyard. They ate your brother Stepan, and they will eat you." They took him and ate him there. After his arrest in 1990, Chikatilo spent 2 months undergoing tests at Moscow's Serbsky Psychiatric Institute. The senior psychiatrist who examined him was Andrei Chikatilo. Of course, with Chikatilo, we have a case of abnormal development from childhood. His mother brought him up on her own, and material conditions were bad. Besides that, there were those experiences directly linked to the occupation, the war, and so on. For example, one of his most vivid memories was of the bombing raids and the destruction they caused, the bodies being carried on wagons. Then came the post-war years, the years of famine, about which so much has been written recently, where there really were registered cases of cannibalism. After finishing his military service, Chikatilo crossed east from Ukraine to Russia and settled in the little town of Rodionovo-Nevshyatskaya, 30 kilometers north of Rostov, where he found work as a telephone engineer. Although tall and fairly good-looking, he was shy with girls and convinced that he was sexually impotent. His family despaired that he would ever find a wife. Then, in 1963, aged 27, he met and married Fayina, a miner's daughter. Despite his sexual problems, he fathered 2 children, daughter Lyudmila and son Yuri. Chikatilo was determined to better himself. His quest for self-improvement brought him to Rostov University, where he studied literature as an external student. One of his classmates was Tamara Tolomayenko.
There was a report on the radio that the trial was beginning in Rostov of a 56-year-old sex maniac named Andrei Chikatilo. I immediately thought about the name. and remembered that I had studied with an Andrei Chikatilo at university. I knew that he was older than I was. The rest of us were younger. So I got out the photograph straight away. After taking it, I looked at it for a long time. He had the kind of eyes that it was unpleasant to look at, even in a photograph. Maybe it was a kind of magnetism in his eyes which made it possible for him to kill so many people, to make them agree to go with him when he asked them.
Chikatilo moved into teaching immediately after graduating from university. As he admitted at his trial, the killing of little Lena Zakotnova in 1978 was the climax of an escalating series of assaults on his pupils, both boys and girls. The classrooms were full of rumors about his activities, but his colleagues were not sure whether to believe them. The school authorities did nothing. It wasn't until 1981 that Chikatilo, then aged 45, was finally drummed out of teaching. No one reported him to the police.
The most noticeable thing about him was that whenever he spoke to anyone, whether to a child or an adult, he never looked them straight in the eye. His eyes were always wandering. There were rumors about him. The boys called him queer. Maybe the school authorities did take note of it. It was all within their competence, on their level. As for us, we heard the rumors, but as they say, boys will be boys, and they could have been saying anything about him.
By now, Chikatilo's terrible sexual obsession was beginning to take hold of him. Long after he killed Lena Zakotnova, he was still reliving what he had done. Rostov's busy railway station, with its crowds of young women, was like a magnet. Chikatilo would spend hours walking the platforms in search of victims. More and more, he spent the night on benches in the waiting room, with the tramps and the prostitutes. We were brought up to believe that all sex was harmful, that we must only work in industry and build communism. All the rest was unnecessary. It was useless. And I was convinced that if it was unnecessary, it didn't matter if I couldn't get my thing to stand up. I wasn't sorry. But all this pressed down on my brain. I didn't want to go there, but the people kept coming, masses of them. You have to lie with beggars for the whole night at railway stations when you go on a business trip, because there are never any vacancies in the hotels. So the people went there, and so did I. I watched a couple of times, and then I became infected. It's just like drugs. By autumn 1981, Chikatilo could resist no longer. Outside Rostov Public Library on the evening of September 3rd, he met Larisa Kachenko, aged 17. They made an unlikely couple. He had been in the reading room, catching up on the communist newspapers. She was on her way to join a youth brigade working in the fields. But when Chikatilo proposed going off together to relax on the river beach, she agreed. They walked together down Rostov's main street, chatting as they went. His years spent as a teacher had given him the ability to talk to young people. Kachenko appears to have suspected nothing as Chikatilo led her down to the opposite bank of the River Don on the outskirts of the city. He promised to buy her food and drink at the leisure complex on the river beach. But they never got there. It was warm summer weather, and they walked through looking for somewhere without people, where they could be alone. At that time, the woods here were much thicker than now. The trees had been cut down since. And he brought her to this place where he tried to have sex with her. But because of his impotence, he didn't succeed in finishing the sexual act. And after that, he killed her. And then he left. The unusual thing about Chikatilo's victims was their diversity. Some were young, innocent children. Others were tramps or cheap prostitutes. They were so different from one another that police were convinced they were dealing not with one, but with several killers. The problem was in those early years that, as a rule, beginning in 1982, we were finding bodies which were little more than skeletons. We couldn't establish the identity of the deceased. It was only after the Institute in Moscow made a reconstruction of the skull that we were able to identify 12 people. We were unable to start our work with the main thing, and that, of course, was the deceased. One of them was 11-year-old Sasha Chapel. It was a warm summer evening in August 1984, and he'd been out with a friend to the cinema in Rostov. It was the last time the two boys saw each other, as Sasha's grandmother remembers.
After the film, they went to Voroshilovsky Prospect, from where the number 10 tram left. Vasily was there with his little brother, and Sasha said to him, "There's your number 10 tram. You go, and I'll wait here for mine." That is what Vasily told the police.
And that was the last you saw of him?
That was all. Then a man was cutting hay on the banks of the Don, and they found him. His mother was called in to identify him. I was with the younger one in the countryside. That was all. Afterwards, we were called back for the funeral.
While Chikatilo continued to kill, those around him still suspected nothing. In 1981, he had begun a new job as a supply clerk at the Rostov Nerud factory. Most of his working time was spent roaming the region, searching for material and spare parts. He kept himself to himself the few hours a week he spent at his desk at headquarters.
I worked with Chikatilo from 1981 to 1984. What is there to say about him? He was a dull, straightforward man who didn't stand out here in any way. Not good and not bad. Outside work, none of us had anything to do with him. When the newspapers reported what he had been up to, I was completely taken by surprise. For a long time, I couldn't believe it until they produced all the proof and showed all this brutality.
By the summer of 1984, Chikatilo had killed more than 30 women and children, 15 of them within that year alone. Although rumors were spreading, the official media kept silent. No indication was given that a serial killer was at large. It was typical of the way the Soviet media focused exclusively on good news in the days before Glasnost. I was working for the news, and 5 times a week the police would bring us photographs of victims found, for instance, on the left bank of the Don or Shakhty. They were disfigured. We used to show them on the TV news in the hope that somebody would identify them and report it to the militia. But no one ever said that it was all one case, at least not among the journalists. That came only after Chikatilo was caught. Local people were not informed at all, even after Chikatilo had already committed tens of murders and they'd been hunting him for years. Children were being killed, but everyone remained silent. If they'd spoken out loud about this, written on every street corner that children had disappeared and in what circumstances, then people would have been careful. People would have been on the lookout at bus stops. No, everyone was silent. If the public was badly informed, it was partly because the local police themselves were in the dark. In the summer of 1983, a top investigator was sent from the public prosecutor's office in Moscow to monitor their work. Vladimir Kazakov was horrified at what he found when he began to read the files. Despite strong similarities between the various murders, The local police were convinced that they were the work not of one man, but of a group of killers, most of them homosexuals. One of them, Yura Kolyenik, was the first to be detained and the first to confess to 11 killings. I began to have very serious doubts about the truthfulness of his testimony. Later, those doubts grew stronger, and they were confirmed when we not only collected evidence that proved their innocence, but we also found proof that the police had used certain methods in their work with them. And, well, to put it lightly, these methods were not completely legal. The 12 years that Chikatilo was at large, there was a serious problem identifying the remains of the victims, which were often badly mutilated. Pavel Chernik, a local artist, was called in to help the local police. In August 1984, a good friend of mine, who is a police colonel and senior investigator, came to see me. He brought me a picture of a disfigured girl, which couldn't be given to the media for identification because it was mutilated. I was asked to make a drawing of what she looked like when she was alive. So I made this drawing. As it turned out later, it was Alexeyeva, one of the many victims of the well-known maniac, Andrei Chikatilo. Almost 10 years later, her brother Vladimir is still puzzling why she agreed to go off with Chikatilo. It's terrible about my sister. She was only 17, and she had her whole life in front of her. She came to spend the holidays, and then such a terrible thing to happen to her. She was a friendly and a decent person. But he managed to attract her. He must have spun her some fairy tale. He was an elderly man, but he must have had a way with words. A month later, in September 1984, when the killings reached a peak, came a major breakthrough. After a night spent trying to pick up women at Rostov railway station, Chikatilo was followed by a policeman in the early hours of the morning across the city here to the central market, where he was arrested. He was taken to the little police station and questioned. When they searched his bag, they found it contained a knife, a piece of rope, and a jar of Vaseline. But there was a problem. Laboratory tests had identified traces of sperm found on the bodies of the victims as belonging to group AB. But Chikatilo's blood was a different group. According to Russian medical experts, all men had the same blood as sperm groups. No one, not even Chikatilo himself, could have known that he was a 1 in a million exception. Although police began to probe him in connection with the killing of Dima Tashnikov, a 10-year-old boy found earlier that year, the medical evidence was against them. The only excuse to hold him was on a minor theft charge that was pending from the factory where he worked. He was released because there was no evidence and there were no grounds to hold him any longer. He was detained and arrested for a theft which he'd carried out earlier. In fact, he was investigated in connection with this case. There was not the slightest evidence. We didn't have a single witness who could identify him. The only case was with Dima Tashnikov in Shakhtinsk. The identikit picture looked like him, but we had tens of identikit pictures and they were all different. That was the only evidence. Plus a different blood group. We didn't find any evidence about him, no solid evidence. Accordingly, the decision was taken to close the case against him relating to this episode. Jail calmed Chikatilo. He was frightened, and for more than 6 months after his release, he didn't kill again. Times were changing. Konstantin Chernenko, the last of the old-style communist leaders, had died and been replaced by the young Mikhail Gorbachev. Later, in 1985, in August, Chikatilo came to Moscow on a business trip. Just outside Domodyedovo, the city's major domestic airport, he was ready to strike again. On August the 1st, Chikatilo was traveling on the local train from Moscow in the direction of the airport at Domodyedovo. On the platform between the carriages, he met his next victim, Natalia Poklistova, who was living almost as a tramp. Her appearance and the fact that she was smoking gave him a desire to commit another crime, this time against her. When Chikatilo invited the girl to go for a walk with him into the woods, they set off in this direction. On August the 3rd, the body of an unknown young girl was found here. It was completely naked and covered with a large number of cuts and stab wounds. There were signs on the palms that the hands had been tied, and there was rope around the neck. The nipples had been cut off. The next day, police identified the victim as Natalia Poklistova, born in 1967. She lived literally 200 meters from the place where her body was found. Poklistova's killing was the turning point. The case was handed to Isa Kostoyev, Deputy-in-Chief of the Investigative Department of the Public Prosecutor's Office and one of their best officers. Under Kostoyev's command, one of the largest police operations in Soviet history was mounted. Over the next 5 years, police were to check almost 500,000 people, a figure equivalent to 1 in 10 of the entire population of the Rostov region. More than 1,000 people were convicted for other crimes they solved along the way. But not Chikatilo. He remained at large, always one step ahead of them. In order to check all possible people involved in the killing, we checked 160,000 owners of private cards who lived in places near the killings. We also checked 2,475 people with previous convictions for sexual crimes. With each of them, it was possible to check where he was at the time of the killing, what he was doing, what he was like when he was released from custody, and how he had behaved when he was in custody, whether he was mentally normal or not, and which blood group he had. Their names were filled out by hand and put into this card index. There were more than 25,000. Chikatilo's name first appeared in our card index at the time of his arrest. On September 13, 1984, he was detained at the main railway station, or rather the main bus station, and handed over to the district department of the police. Then he was handed to the investigating operational group. From that moment, he came into our field division, and we filled in his card. It's still here today. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards on him. These are all the cards that were filled in on Chikatilo. The first was filled in during 1984. The main ones after examination of the criminal and operational material. The last card was filled in when he was arrested in 1990. It didn't help. Again and again, Chikatilo fell through the holes in the police net. The shock of prison was beginning to fade. His 50th birthday had come and gone. He was already a grandfather. But his horrific obsession was stronger than ever. Unable to cope with normal sexual relations, he found the only release through violence. He was spending more and more time hunting for victims. Yet still those closest to him suspected nothing. Even wife Fayina, after 25 years of marriage, had no idea what her husband was really doing during all those nights he spent away. She understood perfectly well that he was impotent from her experience of their sex life. Later, as he said himself, he used to come home after committing these crimes with blood on him and with cuts. Of course, his wife, Fayina, saw all of that. But at the time he committed the crimes, he was working in the supply department. And he explained to her that it was because he was loading barbed wire, metal, and wood. And that was supposedly why he cut himself and had blood on him. I used to go there and take off my trousers. I became completely shameless, I don't know why. I used to take off my trousers in the toilets of railway stations the same way that other people shave or comb their hair. They have water and soap there. So I took off my trousers and started washing. Well, it wasn't proper washing, it was just to clean off the dirt that happened to be there. Well, not dirt, but blood that was spilled. I didn't examine it closely, I just washed it off with soap. A policeman who saw me doing this washing at the station and asked me what I was doing, I said, there was dirt on the streets. So what? They used to check documents at the railway station almost every time I was there. As the years passed, the killings were beginning to get more and more grisly. Some of the bodies bore dozens of wounds. Others were decapitated or had the genitals cut off. Like an addict, Chikatilo needed more and more suffering to obtain his perverted sexual satisfaction. When I spoke to Chikatilo, he said that by the end the sex of the victim didn't matter anymore. What was important were his own actions. The power which he exercised when he was manipulating his victims. And this feeling that he experienced didn't depend in any way on the sex of his victim. It is true that in a number of cases, in the final stages, that homosexual and pedophilic victims prevail. Of the 16 murders which Chikatilo committed between the beginning of 1988 and his arrest in 1990, 11 were of boys. One of those victims was 10-year-old Alyosha Khobotov, whom Chikatilo met in 1980 near a cinema in Shakhty.
It was Monday, August 28th. We were redecorating our apartment, and he was helping me in the morning. At lunchtime, he asked me for permission to go to the park. Mom, I'll go to the playground for a while, to play there. Well, I let him go. I said, don't be long, Lyosha. Be back soon. He left at about 12 or soon after and didn't come back.
For more than 15 months, Lydia Khobotova waited in vain for news of her son. The police found nothing. More and more desperate, she was ready to try anything.
I learned there was a gypsy fortune teller in the Rostov region who helped people, so I thought I would go to her, come what may. She took his photograph, got out her cards and said, "He is lying between heaven and earth." I said, "In what sense?" "He is dead. He was killed by the hand of a sadistic murderer and died a slow death."
Then, at the end of 1990, Chikatilo came to the quiet country station of Leskhoz. On the morning of November the 6th, he brought a woman called Korostik to the next railway station, Lesostep. The aim was the same as always, to take her to a secluded place and murder her. The local policeman on duty spotted a man coming out of the woods and washing his hands. He demanded his papers but found nothing and let him go. The policeman didn't know that Chikatilo had just killed Svetlana Korostik, his 52nd and last victim. But Chikatilo's luck deserted him a week later when the body was found. Police Chief Fetisov was passing and demanded a list of people who had been recorded at the station. He began to read the list and there was Chikatilo. And I said, "Listen, we checked him in 1984. When he was detained at that time, I was on holiday, and when I came back and they showed me the case, they said that they detained him and that he'd fitted almost 100%, except for the fact that the blood group didn't match." When the investigators began to go through Chikatilo's movements over the previous years and compared them with the murders, they found to their astonishment that they fitted together perfectly. Then we started to check his work record. I found that he got a job here at this factory in 1984. We looked up the documents to find out where he was at the moment the killings were committed. Did he leave Rostov on a business trip? No. That means he was here. Could he have committed the murder? Yes, he could. So we put a big question mark on this. Later, he found himself a job at a beer factory in 1984, over in the west. When we checked the documents from that day, the day of the killing of Ilario Novo, we found that he was working there then. Also, very strange. He was working there and the boy was killed. And then, when we put all these coincidences together, we came to the conclusion that he was the murderer. On the afternoon of November 20th, a week after Svetlana Korostik's body was found, police tracked Chikatilo to the town of Novocherkassk and arrested him. He came quietly, without protest. Nor did he say anything as they drove him back the 40 kilometers to Rostov. Name, Chikatilo Andrei Romanovich. Year of birth, 1936. Place of birth, Sumskaya region, Aktir district, village Yablokhnoye. What's your education? Higher education? Higher education. The first few minutes already produced an interesting development, a cut on Chikatilo's finger. But this was nothing compared to the surprise that was in store for police when they received the results of their blood and sperm samples. As the tests 6 years before had shown, Chikatilo's blood was Group A. But to the astonishment of police, his sperm was of a different group, AB. He could be the killer. For more than a week, Kostoyev sat face to face with Chikatilo. To heighten the pressure, he was interrogated not in the police station, but in the local headquarters of the KGB. First, he said nothing, but gradually Kostoyev broke down his resistance. Chikatilo finally confessed to 34 of the 36 murders of which he was accused. Stunning his captors, he then admitted to 19 more, which police until then had not even linked with him. Among them was the murder of 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova, 12 years before, for which Alexander Kravchenko had already been shot. When I went to search his flat, it was in a mess as usual. I was interested in the murder weapon, insofar as all the crimes were committed with a sharp weapon with a blade, in other words, a knife. If I remember correctly, we found some 22 or 24 of them. I've never seen a family with such a quantity of knives. There was no possible justification for such a large number. In the weeks that followed, Chikatilo took his captors on a macabre tour of his killings, amazing them with the accuracy of his memory. Even 10 years after he had killed, he was still able to pinpoint the place down to a few meters. The biggest surprise came with the case of Alyosha Khobotov. Although it was more than 14 months since the boy had disappeared from his home in Shakhty, still nothing was known about his fate. Defendant Chikatilo, Andrei Romanovich. It's now 1600 Moscow time. Following your suggestion, made today in the Botanic Gardens in the city of Rostov, our group has accompanied you to the city of Shakhty. At your suggestion, we have stopped at the cemetery, the central cemetery of the city of Shakhty. Can you lead us from here and show us the place where you committed a crime against the underage boy, Khobotov? Now Chikatilo is telling us where he killed the boy and where he buried the body. The episode is fundamental to the chain of investigation of this series of murders, because we did not know where the body was. And so, it obviously constitutes very weighty proof of Chikatilo's involvement in this murder.
When they found him, I was called to identify him. They showed me the sneakers. I recognized them at once. I had bought them myself. He had them on when he was leaving. The sneakers were covered with blood. Later, we went to Rostov, to the mortuary. It was late in the evening, already night. I caught sight of a box on the expert's desk. I asked, "Where is my son?" "Over there in the box, all folded up." I said, "Open it up. I want to see what is left of him." There were just bones, and the head was a skull. It could only have been his skull because several teeth had been extracted and they were missing. That completely convinced me that it was my son.
Not only Chikatilo's victims suffered, so too did his wife Faina. After threats to her life, she was rushed over the border to Ukraine, where she was given a new identity. Nadezhda Tarasova met her again by chance, just before the trial started.
When I saw her, I simply did not recognize her. She had grown old. Her face had gone dark. She said she was being killed by grief. She was going to the church when I met her. She didn't know where to look. She said, "Nadia, until now, I didn't want to see anybody. But now I've met you, I can pour out my soul to you. It weighs very heavily on me." She said, "I never knew what he was up to." And I said, "How come you never noticed anything, like when he came home and had that bag with him, those things? Couldn't you have just had a look?" She said, "You know, I tried once. He told me off so badly that I said, 'Okay, they're your things.' I didn't try to touch them after that, and didn't touch his bag."
On October 14, 1992, the trial in Rostov moved into its last dramatic phase. Over the previous 6 months, dozens of witnesses had come forward to confirm the case that police and prosecutors had built up so painstakingly. When Leonid Akubjanov read the verdict, he had serious doubts about one of the killings, that of a 15-year-old Armenian girl whom Chikatilo was alleged to have killed in 1983. But apart from that, he had no doubts. Chikatilo appears to have confessed largely in the hope that he would be found to be mentally ill. With that hope gone, now rambling and incoherent, he withdrew his confession. "I didn't sign this list. I didn't admit anything. I signed where I said that I didn't confess. I didn't kill anyone apart from the mafia, the Assyrian mafia I killed. Take me and I'll show you where the bodies are." But it was too late. Chikatilo had already said too much. Akubjanov found Chikatilo guilty of 52 murders. The sentence was set for the next afternoon. "Why should I listen to your rubbish? Now you're trying to force another 10 killings on me." Taking into consideration the monstrous crimes which he committed, the court has no alternative but to impose the only sentence which he deserves. I therefore sentence him to death.
He is not a man, he's an animal, who should not have a place on earth. Why can't our government understand it? Why did they waste all this time with him? The trial lasted 4 months. He said he was sick. How could he be sick? It's me that's sick. I couldn't fill out all the declarations. But him, look at what letters he wrote and what declarations. Execution is too good for him. They should rip him apart as a warning to others.
I don't have the slightest doubt about these killings. Otherwise, there would not have been 52 of them. If there had been doubts about any, then they'd have been left out. The fact that he's been convicted of 52 murders means that the court is completely convinced that the monster Chikatilo killed all of these 52 people. Marat Kabibulin, the state lawyer who had the difficult job of defending Chikatilo, is still in touch with his client. He says the pressure of public opinion made the death sentence inevitable. Although not claiming Chikatilo is innocent, he says he is insane. I have no doubt at all that this is an insane man who is not responsible for his actions. Expert psychiatrists, doctors and scientists in psychiatry would be able to confirm this. Many of them, even on the basis of what they observe, if they were interested, they could hardly doubt that this is a person who is not in any way responsible for his actions. In order to certify someone as mentally sick, you must clearly determine the presence of some kind of psychiatric disorder which is sufficiently pronounced and sufficiently serious to deprive them of the ability to make a choice in a given situation. Despite all his psychological abnormalities, this was not the case with Chikatilo. Chikatilo retained this ability right up to the last. Do you regret that you've committed such crimes? Have you at last begun to repent? I don't know what to repent. They framed me. They pinned more and more confessions on me. Dozens of them. 70 of them. The last question. What do you think of the end of your life? Do you think of death? I don't know. I'm in the other world already. I've been there a long time already. I was killed many times. I'm cut off from this world. Nothing is left in this world. Nothing. Chikatilo appealed against his sentence. His case is currently under consideration by the Russian Supreme Court.